The mirror had been bleeding for 3 weeks. Evangeline discovered it on the morning her grandmother's will was read, a Tuesday that tasted like copper and ash. The solicitor's words had dissolved into background murmur the moment she inherited Blackthorn Manor, that decaying Victorian corpse squatting on the Yorkshire moors. Her hands had trembled as she signed documents, but it was the mirror that truly undid her. She'd found it in the attic, wrapped in moth-eaten velvet, its ornate silver frame tarnished into the color of storm clouds. When she unwrapped it, her reflection stared back with her grandmother's eyes, a resemblance that had always unsettled her. But it was what happened next that shattered the ordinary world into pieces. A thin line of crimson had begun seeping from behind the glass, not on the surface, behind it, as though the mirror contained something bleeding internally, some wound in the dimension it reflected. Each day the blood crept further down, pooling at the frame's base. Yet when Evangeline touched the glass, her fingers came away dry. She'd consulted 3 different doctors. Stress, they said. Grief-induced hallucination. The mind's way of processing loss. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in that convenient car accident 15 years ago. The kind of tragedy that never quite felt like coincidence. The doctors prescribed sleeping tablets and recommended she sell the manor immediately. Evangeline took the tablets. The mirror still bled. The dreams began on the 4th day. She would find herself in gardens that didn't exist, moonlit and impossible, where roses bloomed in shades of burgundy and black. A man moved through those gardens like smoke given form, always just beyond her line of sight. She could never see his face, only the elegant line of his shoulders, the way his fingers brushed across phantom thorns, the sound of his breathing like wind through a cathedral. In the dreams, he was searching for something, someone. The longing in his silhouette was so profound it woke her gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly metallic. "You're calling me," his voice would say, though his lips never moved. "After all these centuries, you're finally calling me." Evangeline would wake with blood under her fingernails, though she hadn't scratched herself. She would wake with the taste of wine on her tongue, though she'd drunk nothing. She would wake knowing, with absolute certainty, that she was remembering someone else's life. The rational part of her, the part that had survived 15 years of polite questions about why she lived so quietly, why she seemed old in spirit despite her 24 years, insisted this was madness. Inherited madness, perhaps. Her grandmother had spent her final years speaking to people who weren't there, insisting they were calling her name from behind the walls. But the dreams felt more real than waking. On the 23rd day of the bleeding mirror, Evangeline stood in the attic wearing her grandmother's silk nightgown. She'd found it in a chest, and it fit perfectly, as though tailored for her exact proportions, and pressed her palm against the glass. The blood rushed toward her hand like it had been waiting. It flooded the mirror's surface, completely obscuring her reflection. In that crimson tide, she saw flashes: a throne room wreathed in shadow, a prince with eyes like amber in firelight, a crown of something that might have been bone or might have been starlight. She saw hands reaching for her across centuries. She saw her own face, younger and older simultaneously, wearing an expression of desperate recognition, and she felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, but something deeper. Something that had been sealed since before she was born. When the mirror returned to normal, her reflection was no longer hers. The woman staring back had her eyes, her mouth, her midnight hair, but ancient knowledge lived in those features. Resignation and hunger and a terrible, magnificent sorrow. This was who she was supposed to be. Not Evangeline Hartley, lonely orphan managing a decaying manor, but someone else entirely. Someone who had been waiting. The phone call came that afternoon. The estate agent informed her that her grandmother's personal effects had been left in the manor's eastern library, a room Evangeline hadn't yet explored. Among them was a journal, leather-bound and sealed with wax. The wax bore a crest, a rose entangled with a crown, surrounded by text in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Forever bound, forever seeking, forever alone until the blood remembers. The rational part of Evangeline screamed at her to burn the journal, salt the manor's floors, flee to London, insanity. But her hands were already moving, already climbing the narrow staircase toward the eastern wing, where dust motes hung like ghosts in the fading afternoon light. The journal waited on a velvet chair beside a fireplace cold for decades. And outside, the October moon rose crimson over the moors, a blood moon Evangeline realized with the certainty of déjà vu. And from somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackthorn Manor's walls, something ancient stirred, something that had been waiting 7 lifetimes for her to finally wake. Evangeline's grandmother's handwriting was madness made elegant. The journal's first entry was dated 1952, the year of Evangeline's grandmother's birth, written in the careful script of someone transcribing rather than creating. The words seemed to flow from muscle memory rather than conscious thought, as though her grandmother's hand was a channel for someone else's voice entirely. "He comes to me in dreams wearing a crown of thorns and starlight. His name tastes like wine and death on my tongue. Cassius, prince of something I cannot remember in waking, but that my blood knows with absolute certainty. He has been searching for me across lifetimes. He says I am the only mortality he has ever loved. He says our blood was bound before God made the first dawn, Evangeline's fingers traced the words, and with each letter the attic seemed to contract. The air grew cold enough to crystallize her breath. The second entry came from 1978. She arrived today, small, angry, perfect. My daughter, she has his eyes, those amber lights that hold centuries. I have named her Margaret, and I have devoted my life to keeping her away from the moors. Cassius comes less frequently now. He understands. The pain in his silhouette is exquisite. He tells me that loving him means generational suffering, that every soul bonded to his will carry the weight of his damnation. He asks if I regret it. I have never lied to him. I do not. Evangeline sank into the velvet chair, her legs suddenly incapable of supporting her weight. Her mother had been a child of her grandmother and something named Cassius. Her mother had died in a car accident at 27, exactly 13 years after giving birth to Evangeline. The dates couldn't be coincidence. Nothing in this manner could be coincidence. She forced herself to turn the pages, watching her grandmother's handwriting deteriorate into something more frantic as the years progressed. The entries grew shorter, more fragmented, a conversation rather than a diary. The blood remembers. Oh God, the blood remembers. She has his gift. I see her moving through the rooms as though through water, as though the air itself is familiar. She's only 9, and already the servants fear her gentle silences. Cassius says she is the one. He says in this lifetime, the binding will complete. I have hidden the mirror. I have hidden the journal. I have hidden the truth. May she forgive me. 23 years old and she's dying. Car accident. No, the Inquisitors caught her. The vampire hunters who have pursued Cassius since 1633. They're clever. They use human agents. Margaret didn't stand a chance. She tried to protect her daughter. She died like a martyr for a faith she didn't even understand. Cassius hasn't spoken to me since. I can feel him, somewhere in the darkness. Mourning his grief is a physical thing. It bends the very light around Blackthorn. Tonight is the blood moon. Tonight, Cassius will attempt the binding. Evangeline will be nearly 2 years old. Too young to consent, yes, but the blood doesn't require words, it only requires recognition. I have put the mirror in the attic. I have written these truths where she will find them. Forgive me, daughter of my daughter. Forgive us both, Cassius, for loving beyond the boundaries of mortal safety. The final entry, in handwriting so shaky it barely resembled her grandmother's script. I'm 71 years old, and tonight the mirror will complete what we began. When I am gone, she will inherit this manor, this mirror, this terrible legacy. She will be haunted by dreams of a man she has never met. She will see blood where there is none. She will hear calling from the darkness that sounds like her own name spoken with infinite longing. And when she finally understands, when the blood memory awakens, she will have to make the choice I never had. She will have to decide if an eternity of darkness is worth the love of a prince who has already lost empires. I hope, with everything that remains of my mortal heart, that she chooses differently than I did. I hope she chooses freedom, but something in my blood, something that is not entirely my own, knows she will choose him. She will choose him because she was born to choose him. Because their souls were bound before time began, and all of this has only been a countdown toward recognition. Evangeline closed the journal with trembling hands. The woman in the mirror, the one who wasn't quite her reflection, smiled with profound sadness. It was a smile that spoke of centuries of waiting, of kingdoms burned, of mothers and daughters sacrificed on the altar of a love that transcended mortality itself. The blood moon climbed higher over the moors, and in the gardens below, where her grandmother had mentioned that nothing grew except flowers in impossible shades, Evangeline heard footsteps on gravel that had been silent for a decade. The sound of someone returning, someone who had been waiting in the darkness for exactly this moment, for the blood to finally remember, for the binding to complete, for his eternal exile to end. She descended the manor's grand staircase in her grandmother's silk nightgown, moving like a woman who had rehearsed this walk across 7 lifetimes. The manor's front door opened before she could touch the handle. The blood moon bathed the gardens in crimson light, and at the center of her grandmother's impossible roses, a figure waited in shadow, tall, elegant, crowned in darkness. His eyes caught the moonlight and burned like amber in a cathedral of night. He spoke her name, not Evangeline, but something older, something that meant everything. And in the blood moon's light, Evangeline finally remembered what she was supposed to be. He did not move as she crossed the threshold into the gardens. The blood moon bathed everything in crimson so deep it looked like the world was drowning. The roses, those impossible roses that her grandmother had tended for decades, seemed to pulse with that same dark light, as though they were not flowers at all but something captured from a dream, preserved in botanical form. Evangeline's bare feet found the gravel path without thought, her body remembering a geography her conscious mind had never known. The silk nightgown moved around her like water, and the air itself seemed to part before her, as though the night had been waiting for her passage. He remained motionless until she was close enough to see the damage. It was subtle, written in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands hung at his sides like instruments he'd forgotten how to use. His face was aristocratic in the way of old money and older bloodlines, sharp cheekbones that might have been carved from marble, a mouth that seemed engineered for quotations and wine, dark philosophy. But his eyes held the true measure of his tragedy. They were ancient, inconceivably, unbearably ancient. "Evangeline," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through a desecrated cathedral. "You've finally come back to me." She should have been afraid. Every instinct honed by 4 years of ordinary life screamed that this man, this creature, was danger incarnate. His presence carried the weight of centuries, the scent of crypts and old blood, and something darker than either. The hunger radiating from him was a physical thing, visible in the way the air seemed to curve toward him, drawn to his gravity. Instead, she felt herself exhale as though she'd been holding her breath since before birth. "I don't know you," she whispered. "You lie," he said gently. "Not from cruelty but from mercy. Your waking mind doesn't know me. Your soul knows me the way it knows the color of its own essence. The way a river knows the ocean it flows toward." He turned slightly and the moonlight caught the left side of his face, revealing a scar, not disfiguring, but present. It ran from temple to jaw, silver, pale against his pale skin, and it glowed faintly in the blood moon's light as though marked with something phosphorescent. "The hunters marked me in 1633, he said, following her gaze. "I was not so fortunate in my next encounter with them." "Your face is beautiful," Evangeline heard herself say. For the first time, something like vulnerability crossed his features. "You are kind. Your grandmother was kind. Your mother was kind. It is, I think, the cruelest inheritance they could have given you. Kindness to the damned only prolongs their suffering." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of him toward her, not the animal musk she'd somehow expected, but something refined and terrible. Aged wine and copper and the particular perfume of old libraries, of pages untouched for centuries. Of solitude so profound it had taken on its own scent. "Who are you?" she asked. "In this life, I have no name that matters. I have been called Cassius by your bloodline for 4 centuries. That is perhaps the only name I still recognize as my own." He turned fully to face her, and she saw how carefully he moved, as though managing his own presence, containing a hunger that might devour her if released. "I was a prince once. Not of great consequence. There were 17 of us, all scrambling over the same crumbling European throne. I had brothers, a kingdom, the usual corruptions and intrigues of medieval nobility." He gestured toward the gardens, and Evangeline saw them differently now, not just flowers, but a deliberate composition. A garden designed in the style of a long-vanished court, with architecture implied by the arrangement of roses, with fountains that hadn't flowed in decades but whose placement suggested memory of water. "This garden is all that remains of Valdris," he continued. "The kingdom I ruled for 43 years before the curse took me. Before I became this." He looked down at his hands, turning them as though they belonged to a stranger. "A vampire hunter blessed by a dying saint in 1451 decided my reign was heresy. He blessed a dagger with prayers and drove it into my heart during a feast. I should have died. Instead I became." Evangeline moved closer, drawn by a magnetism she didn't understand and couldn't resist. "The blessing turned you." "The saint was dying," he said with something that might have been humor. If humor could sound so tragic. "She blessed the dagger with the only power she had left, eternal life. But also eternal hunger, eternal night, eternal separation from the God she served. She wanted me to suffer for what she saw as my spiritual corruption. She succeeded beyond her design. Centuries of suffering, centuries of hunger, centuries of watching every mortal I loved age and wither while I remained perfectly, eternally unchanged." He paused, his amber eyes searching hers. "And then I met your ancestor. In 1623, in a garden very much like this one. She was 37 years old and widowed, and she was reading Dante in the moonlight. I was starving, I've always been starving, and I intended to simply take what I needed. Instead, I found myself unable to feed from her. The moment our eyes met, something in my curse broke open. The soul bond." Evangeline whispered, though she didn't know how she knew the phrase. "Yes. Blood bonds are simple things, hunger drawing itself across distance, desire given chemical and supernatural form. But a soul bond." He trailed off, looking at her with an expression so raw she could barely witness it. "A soul bond is recognition. It is the curse admitting there exists at least one soul it doesn't wish to consume. For your ancestor, that bond was a gift and a torment. She lived a long life, but with the knowledge that eternity waited for her after it ended. She was reborn to me across 7 lifetimes, each one shorter than the last, each one bringing her closer to the moment when she would finally accept the dark gift I've been offering." "And my mother?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew. "Your mother was caught by the hunters before she could choose. She died protecting you from them, knowing you carried the binding in your blood. It has been my greatest grief and most powerful hope." He reached out slowly, carefully, as though approaching a creature who might bolt. His fingers stopped just short of touching her cheek. "You were born under the blood moon, Evangeline. Your mother ensured that your first breath coincided with the moment when the binding was strongest. You've been tethered to me since birth, not through consumption, but through intention. Through sacrifice." "My grandmother," Evangeline said. "Your grandmother was my voice in the mortal world. She carried messages from me in dreams. She prepared this manor as a sanctuary, a place where the boundaries between our worlds grow thin. She bled herself into that mirror, night after night, so that when you were old enough, when the binding had matured, you would see him waiting. You would remember. Remember what? Evangeline's voice broke. I'm 24 years old. I've never lived another life. I've never been anyone but myself. Haven't you? He finally let his fingers brush her cheek, and she gasped at the sensation. Not cold, as she'd expected, but cool like marble in moonlight, like the touch of stone that has never known the sun. Haven't you always felt like you were waiting for something? Haven't you always seemed to know things you couldn't have learned? Haven't you moved through life feeling like a ghost haunting your own body? She wanted to deny it. Instead, she leaned into his touch. What are you asking me? She whispered. The same thing I've been asking through your bloodline for nearly 4 centuries, he said, and his voice was the wind moving through a kingdom of graves. Will you stay with me in the darkness? Will you let me love you in the way my curse allows, entirely, consuming eternally? Will you drink from my wrist and become what I am so that we can finally stop this cycle of loss and rebirth? Will you be my covenant, my redemption, my damnation made beautiful? The blood moon hung directly overhead, and Evangeline understood that she had been born for this moment. She had been born for him. The first kiss tasted like coming home. There was no careful seduction, no gradual surrender, just the abrupt certainty that had been waiting her entire life. His mouth found hers with the precision of someone who had memorized the exact geometry of her lips across previous incarnations, and she opened to him like a prayer answering itself. She tasted copper, old wine, something deeper that might have been his soul, if souls had flavor. His hands tangled in her midnight hair, and she felt rather than heard the growl that began in his chest. A sound that should have terrified her but instead had flooded her with desire so acute it became indistinguishable from pain. She pulled herself closer, trying to merge the space between them, and felt his hesitation flicker like a dying candle. No, she murmured against his mouth. Don't stop. I could kill you, he whispered, even now, especially now. The hunger is? She didn't. That was the revelation, the absolute certainty that would have broken a woman tethered only to ordinary life. But Evangeline was not ordinary. She was a blood-sworn soul tethered to a cursed prince, and the hunger radiating from him was a symphony that only she knew how to play. His hands moved to her waist, drawing her against him, and she felt the proof of his struggle, the tremor in his muscles, the way his breathing came ragged and desperate. He was centuries old, countless victories over the hunger written into the fiber of his being, and yet for her, he was struggling like a boy at the edge of manhood. Cassius, she said, and his name on her tongue tasted like remembering. Cassius, I'm not afraid. You should be, he said, but he was already pulling back, setting distance between them with the care of someone handling a bomb. You should be absolutely, eternally terrified. I am 817 years old, and in all that time I have never learned to be gentle. I have only learned how to hunger. The moonlight caught the scar that ran down the left side of his face, and Evangeline reached out to trace it. Her fingers found the silver line, and beneath her touch it seemed to glow brighter, to throb with its own terrible rhythm. Tell me. Hiss. He caught her hand and pressed it fully against the scar. This is where I failed. In 1724 there was a coven. The Valdres bloodline had become fashionable among the young vampires of Eastern Europe. They wanted me to teach them my curse, to explain the secret of the soul bond. I refused. They saw it as weakness. They attacked me with holy water blessed by a priest who actually believed in salvation. The water burned the left side of my face. The damage healed imperfectly, a constant reminder that even 8 centuries of existence doesn't guarantee survival. She leaned up and pressed her lips to the scar and felt him shudder. What are you doing? His voice was barely a whisper. Remembering, she said. All the times you were hurt, all the times you waited, all the times you came to my ancestors in dreams and they sent you away. I'm remembering that too now. It was true. The memories were flooding in, not in the way the journal had suggested, but in flashes and moments, fragmented pieces of lives lived in parallel. She could taste the wine her ancestor had drunk when she first declined the dark gift. She could feel the terror her mother had known, caught by hunters who understood what she was. She could sense the isolation her grandmother had endured, carrying Cassius in her heart, while raising a daughter who would never know her father. And underneath it all, deeper than bone, she felt the binding itself, that soul, tether that had been burning since before her conception, drawing them toward this exact moment under the blood moon. The memories will overwhelm you, Cassius said, and there was genuine fear in his voice now. Not fear of her rejection, but fear of her destruction. The human mind was not designed to carry 7 lifetimes. You'll lose coherence. You'll scatter across the centuries like a broken mirror. I've watched it happen before, to vampires who attempted to bond with mortals who weren't prepared. Their consciousness fractures. They become shells animated by hunger alone. Then change me, Evangeline said. Complete the binding. Don't leave me suspended between worlds. No. He turned away abruptly, moving to the center of the garden where the roses grew thickest. In the blood moon's light, his silhouette became something mythological, not entirely human, but not quite monster either. Something caught between categories, between hope and damnation. I will not. Your grandmother feared this moment, and she was right to fear it. The binding requires a blood exchange, yes, but the exchange itself requires consent that is truly free, not tainted by memory or compulsion or the weight of 7 lifetimes of obligation. It is free, Evangeline said, following him to the garden's heart. Cassius, I'm choosing this. You're choosing an echo, he said bitterly. You're choosing a woman named Mathilde who died in 1703, and Agnes who drowned fleeing the hunters, and Catherine who went mad from the memories. You're choosing everyone but yourself. And I will not be the instrument of your dissolution. Evangeline felt anger flare through her, hot, ancient, pure. She understood suddenly why her ancestors had always been kind to him, had never blamed him, had carried his love as a benediction rather than a curse. She understood because she felt it too, the impossibility of his position, the way his power and his helplessness were perfectly counterbalanced, the way he was the strongest creature in this garden and simultaneously the most trapped. Mathilde knew the risk, she said. Agnes and Catherine knew the risk, and I know the risk. But you're deciding for me, just like every vampire lord decides for every mortal they encounter, that they're too fragile for the truth, too weak for the choice. But the choice is mine to make, Cassius. The binding is mine to accept or reject. You don't have the right to protect me from myself. For a long moment, he didn't move. The blood moon climbed higher and Evangeline felt the moment approaching, the astronomical apex when the boundaries between worlds would be thinnest. It was coming in moments. She could feel it like a breath held too long, like the pause before thunder. I am afraid, he said finally. I am afraid because I have loved only in darkness for 8 centuries, and I don't know how to love anything but destruction. I am afraid because every woman I have ever truly loved has either rejected me or died because of me. I am afraid because you are the first soul I have encountered in all of time who might actually survive me. And surviving me means living in darkness forever. It means becoming the thing that hunts in the night. It means, he stopped as she pressed her wrist to his mouth. The offer hung between them like a covenant already written. Then let me be your darkness, she whispered. Let me be the night that holds you. Cassius, I have been waiting my entire life for this moment. Not Mathilde, not Agnes, not Catherine. Me, Evangeline. This incarnation, this moment, this blood moon, I'm choosing you. His control shattered. There was a moment of absolute clarity where she understood exactly what she was inviting. She felt his fangs extend, felt the hunger that had been building across centuries coalesce into a single, irresistible force. She felt the difference between his carefully maintained aristocratic pretense and the actual predator beneath. And then she felt his teeth pierce her wrist, and the pain transformed into something transcendent. The world inverted, reality fractured and reformed around that single point of contact, her blood flowing into his mouth, and with it, the barrier between them dissolving completely. She could feel him drinking not just her blood but her essence, her memories, her consent written across every cell. She could feel him filling with something he'd been missing for centuries, not just sustenance, but completion. Her knees buckled, and he caught her with inhuman grace, his other hand cradling the back of her head as he drank. The pain transformed into ecstasy, transformed into transcendence. She could see through his eyes, could feel the universe the way an immortal predator felt it, vast and hungry and impossibly lonely. She could taste the weight of 8 centuries on his tongue, and she could feel the moment approaching. The moment when he would offer his own wrist, when the binding would complete, when she would become what he was. The blood moon reached its apex. The boundaries between worlds grew gossamer thin, and from somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackthorn Manor, from the moors, from the crypts beneath the foundations, from places that existed only in nightmare and ancient history, something else began to wake. Something that had been waiting for this binding to complete. Something that knew exactly what a soul, bonded vampire represented, and why it had to be stopped. The vision came as Cassius was pulling back, his fangs retracting, his eyes returning to their human mask. But Evangeline's wrist remained in his hand, and with the exchange of blood came something neither of them had anticipated, a reversal of the usual flow. Instead of him pouring into her, she was suddenly flooding into him, and through that flood came 750 years of his memories. She gasped, nearly collapsing as centuries compressed themselves into moments. Cassius caught her fully, his arms around her waist, his mouth still wet with her blood, his face twisted in shock. This shouldn't be possible, he breathed. The binding doesn't work this way. The memories don't, but they did. Evangeline stood in a palace that had been burned to ash 800 years ago. She felt the cold marble of Valdres beneath her feet, saw the throne room through Cassius's eyes as they were in 1451, before the curse when he was merely a man. A beautiful man, yes. Powerful in the way of nobles, cruel in the casual way of power, but fundamentally mortal. She felt the priest's rage. Not a holy rage, but the rage of a man who had come to Valdres seeking mercy and found only indifference. The priest's daughter, made an example of, made property of because she had caught a prince's eye. Made broken because she had refused to break beautifully. She felt the dagger slide into his heart, and she felt the prayer, not a blessing but a curse wearing the mask of blessing. Let you live forever with your hunger, unable to sate it except with the innocent. Let you remember every face of every victim, let you exist in darkness, feeling the sun like a knife at the edge of your eternal night. The curse had been precise, methodical, not the supernatural accident that Cassius had always presented it as, but a carefully crafted damnation, the prayer of a dying woman given teeth by her absolute faith. Evangeline stumbled forward, still in that palace, still seeing through Cassius's eyes. She saw the transformation, painful beyond imagining, his body breaking and reforming into something designed for predation. She saw his first feeding, his horror at what he had become. She saw the centuries unfold. She saw him walk through the Renaissance, deliberately staying away from centers of learning where his face might be remembered. She saw him in the Enlightenment, pretending at enlightenment while burning with darkness. She saw him in the Industrial Revolution, watching the world reshape itself into something as unnatural and metal as his own cursed existence. And she saw the moment he first encountered her ancestor Mathilde in 1623, reading Dante in a garden very much like this one. And Evangeline finally understood the truth that all 7 lifetimes had been too fragmented to grasp. The soul bond was not accidental. It was chosen. Cassius had not been drawn to Mathilde by chance. In 1622, exactly 1 year before their meeting, he had broken into the archives of sacred penitence in Vienna. He had found the original record of the curse, the priest's prayer, documented in elegant medieval script. And beneath it, in careful modern handwriting, a note. The curse can be broken only by a soul that carries the mark of innocence without corruption, power without tyranny, light tempered by genuine shadow. Such a soul comes once in 1,000 years. When you find her, you will recognize her as home. The note was unsigned, but Evangeline knew who had written it. She could feel the knowledge in Cassius's memory. The priest's daughter had not died in despair. She had survived, fled to a convent, and spent her remaining decades trying to find a way to save the man who had destroyed her. The curse had been meant as punishment, but she had discovered that curses, like all prayers, could be rewritten if you understood their language deeply enough. Mathilde had carried the blood of that rewritten curse in her veins without knowing it. And Evangeline carried it in an even purer form, passed down through 7 lifetimes of women who were being bred, carefully, systematically, toward redemption. Her own family had been using her as a tool for breaking a curse for 2 centuries. The vision released her, and Evangeline gasped back into the moonlit garden. Cassius held her, his face a portrait of guilt and terrible knowledge. "You knew," she said, her voice barely recognizable as her own. "You've known all along." "I knew what the curse breaker's prophecy promised," he said quietly. "I didn't know if it was true. I didn't know if you, any incarnation of you, would be willing to see it through. I came to Mathilde intending only to confirm the bloodline, to begin the process of seeking, to suffer eternally if the prophecy was lies. Instead, I met her and I loved her instantly and completely, and that love was real regardless of prophecy or duty or curse. But you were using her," Evangeline said. "Using me." "Yes," Cassius said, and there was no defense in his voice, no plea for understanding. "I was and I am still, because whether I love you or use you, you are still the only possibility I have ever had for redemption. You are still the only soul I have encountered in 800 years that does not inspire hunger, only devotion. So I am guilty, Evangeline, completely guilty of every crime of manipulation and deception. And I would do it all again, because the alternative is eternal darkness alone." She pulled away from him, and he let her go immediately, respecting the boundary even as his eyes tracked her with the desperation of a starving man watching bread being removed. The blood moon hung directly overhead, and Evangeline became aware of something else, a presence at the edge of the garden, growing stronger. Multiple presences. The hunters were coming. They could sense what had happened, the beginning of the binding, the moment when a new vampire was being created. "They're coming," Cassius said, hearing her realization. "The Inquisitors, the ones who have pursued me since 1451. They've always known about the curse breaker prophecy. They've been hunting your family line for 700 years, trying to prevent the binding before it could complete." "Then we run," Evangeline said. "We're," Cassius asked quietly. "They exist in both worlds now. Daywalkers, enhanced by blood magic and holy relics. They've sacrificed their humanity to become instruments of divine judgment. They will not stop until one of us is dead." The boundaries of the garden began to shimmer. The roses seemed to fade, as though remembering they were only ever a memory of a kingdom that no longer existed. And in the space between moments, Evangeline understood what her grandmother had truly been preparing her for. The choice had never been between loving Cassius and rejecting him. The choice had always been between surviving to love him, or becoming his curse's final victim. The hunters crossed the garden threshold, and their silhouettes burned with a light that was not quite divine, something corrupted, something that had been pure, and had been twisted by centuries of obsession into a weapon against darkness. And Cassius pulled her close and whispered against her midnight hair. "I'm sorry, my love. I'm sorry I couldn't give you better than this." The first hunter emerged from the dissolved shadows like a nightmare taking physical form. She had been beautiful once. Evangeline could see that in the high cheekbones, the delicate structure of the face. But centuries of something had worn away the beauty, replacing it with purpose. Her eyes glowed with a white, hot light that seemed to burn from inside her skull, and the holy water that clung to her skin sizzled against the blood moon's light. Cassius, the hunter said, and her voice was multiple voices, as though an entire congregation had been compressed into a single throat. Brother of the blessed damnation, we have come to end this. Behind her, 2 more hunters materialized. A man with a chest marked with ritual scars that glowed like lava beneath his skin. A younger figure that Evangeline's enhanced senses, heightened by the partial blood bond, recognized as recently turned. Perhaps only a decade into their hunger, Cassius stepped in front of Evangeline with the careful deliberation of someone moving through deep water. His aristocratic mask had fallen away, and what remained was nothing remotely human. His fangs extended to their full length, his eyes became entire universes of gold and crimson, his body seeming to expand as the hunger he'd held in check for centuries rose to meet this threat. Ariadne, he said, and in the name was centuries of history. I thought you died in Vienna, when the fire took the archives. I did, the first hunter said and smiled with teeth that were not quite teeth, and I was reborn, cleansed. Remade as what I was always meant to be, a servant of light to devour your darkness. She moved, and the speed was not predatory but something else, something blessed. A guardian's speed, perfected through prayer and sacrifice. Her hand came toward Cassius's throat, and Evangeline realized in that moment that the blood exchange hadn't completed. She was still human, still mortal, still vulnerable. But she wasn't helpless. The memories that had flooded into her from Cassius included more than just his centuries of accumulated rage. They included his fighting knowledge. 700 years of combat had been compressed into her muscle memory. And more than that, the new blood in her veins granted her strength that no mere human possessed. She moved without thinking, pulling a thorn from the nearest rose. Not a normal thorn, but one that seemed to have retained some of the magic that had created this garden. It glowed faintly in her palm. Ariadne's holy water-blessed fingers were inches from Cassius's throat when Evangeline drove the rose thorn through the hunter's hand. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Ariadne screamed, a sound so pure and terrible it seemed to crack the blood moon itself. Where the thorn pierced her flesh, the light burning inside her began to leak out like luminous blood, and beneath the light, Evangeline could see something else. Beneath the consumed hunter was a woman who had been hollowed out, and the hollowness had been filled with something that was not divine but profoundly inverted. Divinity twisted into a weapon, goodness weaponized into cruelty. The second hunter lunged at Evangeline, and Cassius moved. He moved like poetry written in violence. His fangs found the hunter's throat, and the speed was such that there was almost no struggle. The hunter with the ritual scars fell, and Cassius drank, not with the careful restraint he'd shown with Evangeline, but with the desperate hunger of a man who had been holding back his true nature for centuries. The youngest hunter, the decade, turned, hesitated. In that hesitation, Evangeline saw something that made the human part of her, the part still mourning her grandmother, still grieving her mother, recoil. The youngest hunter's eyes held no zealotry, no twisted purpose. They held only fear and the terrible knowledge that she had made a mistake 8 years ago when the elder inquisitors had promised her salvation and delivered only servitude. Run, Evangeline said. The young hunter stared at her, disbelieving. Run, Evangeline repeated, and in her voice was the authority of something ancient and wounded. Whatever they promised you, it's a lie. Whatever they made you into, you can unmake it. Find a place where the sun still rises and remember what you were before darkness took you. For a moment, the young hunter stood frozen. Then she turned and fled into the darkness of the moors, and Evangeline chose not to call Cassius to follow. Some choices had to remain possible. Ariadne, wounded by the rose thorn, began to scream again, but this time the scream was changing, transforming. The light burning inside her was consuming her from within, the inverted divinity turning on itself now that it had been wounded by something that existed between worlds. Cassius, Evangeline said quietly. She's suffering. He understood immediately. He went to Ariadne, and though Evangeline turned away from the mercy he offered, the silence that followed was somehow gentler than the screaming had been. Even in feeding, even in the act that should have been monstrous, Cassius maintained a kind of grace. When it was finished, the garden was silent except for the sound of the blood moon's passage through the sky. Cassius stood alone in the center of the rose garden, and when he turned to face her, Evangeline saw the transformation in his eyes. The desperation was gone, replaced by something final. He had killed the hunters, he had drunk their blood. He was now fully the thing the curse had made him, not struggling against his nature anymore, but accepting it, accepting what he was meant to be, accepting that she was meant to be beside him in that darkness. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough with blood and despair. I'm sorry that the first thing your awakened self witnessed was killing. I'm sorry that I cannot offer you better than a war that will never end. Evangeline walked toward him across the rose garden, stepping over petals that had fallen from flowers that bloomed only in dreams. I'm still not one of you, she said. The binding didn't complete. I'm still mortal, yes, he said, and the word was an admission of failure. Then complete it, she said. But not by feeding Cassius. By covenant, by choice, by love instead of hunger. She extended her wrist again, but this time when his fangs extended, he did something different. He drew a single line of blood from her arm and brought his own wrist to his mouth, drawing blood that glowed faintly with immortal power. When he pressed his wrist to her lips, the taste was not of consumption but of gift, of a king offering his own eternal life as a crown to be worn. And as she drank, Evangeline felt the binding truly complete, not the blood flow, but the recognition. The soul connection that had been building for 7 lifetimes solidified into something immutable. She could feel his consciousness alongside her own. She could feel the centuries of his life, no longer fragmentary memories but lived experience integrated into her own sense of self. She was becoming him, and he was becoming her, and the rose garden seemed to pulse with approval, as though the kingdom of Valdris was acknowledging the coronation of its new queen. The blood moon began to descend from its apex, and in the manor behind them, alarms began to sound, not from the hunters, but from deeper places. From beneath the foundations, from the blood locked in its stones, from 700 years of curses and counter-curses awakening. The real danger, Evangeline understood with the clarity of someone newly bound to an immortal, was only beginning. The manor had never been merely a manor. That became clear as Cassius pulled her into the structure, bolting doors that had stood open for decades. The chandeliers blazed with candles that had not been lit, could not have been lit by any mortal hand, and the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched Evangeline's transformed heartbeat. "The manor is bound to me," Cassius said as they moved through corridors that seemed to shift with each step. "Your grandmother made a covenant with the land itself. Every stone, every foundation, every crypt beneath the structure is tied to the soul binding. It's a stronghold against the outside, but—" He paused, and Evangeline felt what he felt, a wrongness at the core of the manor. Something that had been sealed, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment when the binding reached its critical point. "What is it?" she asked. "The covenant chamber," he said quietly. "The place where your grandmother first accepted the bond. Every soul binding requires a chamber where the oath can be witnessed by something beyond human understanding. A place where the magic itself can acknowledge what has been promised." The floor beneath their feet became stone steps, descending. They were moving downward, deeper into the manor, toward its roots. The air grew cooler and Evangeline's enhanced senses picked up the scent of something ancient, not merely old, but primordial. The smell of earth that had never known sunlight, of blood spilled in ritual, of words spoken in languages that had no names in any living tongue. The chamber opened before them like the mouth of some slumbering cathedral. It was vast, impossibly vast. How something so enormous could exist beneath the manor was a question that made Evangeline's newly transformed mind ache. The chamber's ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the walls were carved entirely from black stone that seemed to absorb the light of Cassius's conjured flames. In the center of the chamber stood a circle, not drawn but carved, a massive spiral pattern that seemed to move if you looked at it too long. And at the circle's heart stood a figure made entirely of shadow and starlight. It had no face, but Evangeline knew who it was, the witness, the entity that existed in all soul-binding ceremonies, the something that was not quite divine, but not entirely mortal either. It was the threshold between worlds, the judge of covenants, the keeper of promises made in blood. "The prince returns," it said, and the words came not through sound but through direct understanding in Evangeline's consciousness. "The prince brings one who is half broken, half made. The binding is incomplete." "It is complete," Cassius said, and his voice held the conviction of someone who had already accepted whatever judgment awaited. "She has drunk my blood and accepted the covenant. She knows what she is becoming. She is becoming an becoming simultaneously," the witness said, and Evangeline could feel it examining her, cataloging the changes occurring in her body with every moment. The mortal flesh is resisting the transformation. The soul already bonded, but the blood is new to hunger. This is not a true vampire, and yet it is no longer a true human. "I know," Evangeline said and was surprised at how steady her voice was. "I feel it. I'm caught between. To complete the transformation, you must pass through the trial of shadows. You must walk the darkness of your prince's past and emerge with your humanity intact. If you fail, you will become a thrall, eternally bound to him through hunger, but without the consciousness to resist. You will be a beautiful, terrible thing that remembers being human but no longer is. Your prince will spend eternity watching you slowly hollow out." Cassius moved forward instantly, his entire body radiating refusal. "No, I won't allow it. She doesn't have the strength. 7 lifetimes of memory in a single body, just awakened hunger, mortal fear. She won't survive the trial." "Then the binding remains incomplete," the witness said. "And incomplete bindings must be resolved. The vampire grows mad with the presence of a soul he cannot fully consume. The mortal grows mad with the presence of consciousness too vast for a human brain. In 3 nights, if the trial is not undertaken, one or both of you will choose dissolution rather than suffer the incompleteness." The witness's form began to fade, but not entirely. It became translucent, as though it was already half dissolved. "The trial begins now. The darkness of memory awaits. Survive it and she becomes what she was born to be. Fail it, and he will destroy her himself rather than let her suffer. The chamber shifted. Suddenly they were no longer alone. The shadows on the walls became, not people but impressions of people, Cassius's victims. 700 years of every person he had fed on, every consciousness he had consumed, every death he had caused. They were not ghosts exactly, more like moments of agony crystallized into spectral form. And they were all turned toward Evangeline. She felt his anguish before she saw his face. Cassius was kneeling, his entire frame shaking. "This is my burden," he said. "Not yours, never yours." But Evangeline understood what the witness had been doing. This wasn't a punishment for her, it was a gift. A way to give her the knowledge she needed to love him fully, not despite what he was, but knowing exactly what he was. She walked toward the nearest shadow, a young man, barely more than a boy, marked with the date 1523. "I was the potter's apprentice," the shadow memory said, and his voice held no hate, only endless sorrow. "I did nothing to deserve him. He was hungry, I was there. That is all." Evangeline placed her hand on the shadow's arm, and felt the moment of death. The fear, the desperate hope that death would be quick. The final moment when consciousness fragmented and disappeared into the vampire's hunger. It was terrible and devastating and absolutely unbearable. She turned to Cassius. "How many?" she asked quietly. "Thousands," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thousands of thousands across centuries. Every one of them a failure on my part. Every one of them a murder I could not prevent. But you didn't kill them because you wanted to," Evangeline said. "You killed them because you had to. Because the curse demands hunger above all else." "That doesn't absolve me," Cassius said. "It doesn't bring them back. It doesn't undo the agony." Evangeline walked through the chamber, encountering each shadow, each moment of death, each consciousness that had been ended because she, in all her incarnations, had not yet awakened to save him. She felt the weight of all of it. Not just the guilt of the murders, but the guilt of her own bloodline's knowledge that those murders would continue until the binding was complete. Her grandmother had known. Every grandmother across 7 lifetimes had known. They had let it happen. All of it. Every death, every murder, every hollow moment of agony, they had permitted it to continue because they believed in prophecy, in redemption, in the idea that some curses could be broken if you sacrificed enough innocent lives. Evangeline wanted to rage at the injustice of it. Instead, she walked to the center of the spiral and turned to face all the shadows at once. "I acknowledge you," she said. "I acknowledge every death, every moment of terror, every consciousness that ended in darkness. And I offer you a covenant: no more. No more deaths. No more hunger that demands payment in your lives. Whatever price needs to be paid for his redemption, I will pay it. But the murders end now." The shadows seemed to pause, as though considering. "Can she promise that?" one of them asked, an ancient voice, someone who had died before the Renaissance began. "Can a mortal-turned-vampire promise to resist the hunger that will eventually consume her?" "No," Evangeline admitted. "I can't promise I won't feel hunger, but I can promise I will choose not to kill. I will choose to find another way, and if I fail, if the hunger overwhelms me and I take an innocent life, then I will accept judgment from all of you. I will offer myself to you as my prince once had to offer himself to the curse." The shadows began to dissolve, not out of acceptance but because the trial was complete. Evangeline had looked at what Cassius was, truly looked, without flinching, and she had not turned away. She had seen his monstrosity and chosen love anyway. The chamber reformed around them, the walls solidifying again, the floor becoming stable ground, and Evangeline felt the final transformation begin. Her heartbeat accelerated, shifted, became something new. The hunger in her veins stopped being an invading force and started becoming her own essence. The memories that had been fragmentary integrated into a unified consciousness that spanned 7 lifetimes. She was no longer half-broken. She was becoming new. The transformation took 3 nights. In the first night, Evangeline experienced every death of hunger. Her body, still clinging to mortal patterns, demanded sustenance, but her new predator's instinct understood that no human food would satisfy. She lay in the manor's eastern chamber with Cassius beside her, his hand never leaving her shoulder, and she felt herself being unmade and remade with each moment. "It hurts," she whispered during the worst of it, her voice hoarse from screaming silently. "I know," Cassius said, and his voice was the only thing keeping her anchored to consciousness. "I know, my love, I know." He didn't offer to end it. That was his true grace. He didn't offer mercy in the form of death or release. He offered presence. He offered witness to her transformation. In the second night, Evangeline's senses came online in a cascade of overwhelming sensation. She could hear the heartbeats of mice in the manor's walls. She could smell the blood moving through Cassius's immortal veins, and the smell was intoxicating and terrible and absolutely necessary. She could sense the night itself, the darkness that other creatures feared, and feel it as comfort and home. But more than her senses, she could feel her consciousness expanding. The 7 lifetimes of memory were no longer intrusive. They were integrated, accessible, part of her. She could recall Mathilde's first meeting with Cassius with perfect clarity. She could remember Agnes fleeing the hunters, Catherine succumbing to madness. She could feel her grandmother's sacrifice, her mother's courage, and understand that every moment of the last 200 years had been preparation for this night. She sat up, and the movement was faster than thought. Cassius moved with her, matching her speed, mirroring her newfound grace. They moved to the manor's windows, and Evangeline felt her senses expand even further. She could sense the hunters withdrawing from the moors, licking wounds, regrouping. She could feel the young hunter she'd released, who had found shelter in a monastery somewhere in England, her humanity slowly reasserting itself. She could sense the world as a predator senses it, full of prey, full of temptation, full of endless possibility. And she could feel the hunger in Cassius responding to her transformation. "You're different," he said, his voice rough with need. "The hunger in you is different from mine. It's not consumed by the curse, it's curious, exploratory, like a wolf learning it has fangs for the first time." "Is that wrong?" Evangeline asked. "No," he said and pulled her close. "It's magnificent." The third night was when the trial reached its critical point. The manor's doors burst open, and Evangeline's newly transformed senses recognized the threat immediately, not the hunters but something older. The Inquisitors had called for reinforcements, and this time they came with what they called a sanctified sacrifice. A young woman, barely 20, bound in silver and wrapped in blessed cloth. Her blood sang with the particular frequency of someone who had been trained from birth to be a tool of the divine. A blood memory, Evangeline realized. Someone engineered to carry the echo of every vampire they'd ever encountered. A living weapon designed to override the killing instinct. Cassius moved to the threshold, his fangs extended, ready to refuse them entry. "No," Evangeline said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I understand what they're doing. They're offering a choice. The right prey, someone whose death wouldn't be a murder but a necessity. Someone whose death would be mercy." She felt Cassius's entire body tense with rejection. "Never," he said. "Not for you," Evangeline said. "For me. My trial isn't complete until I've tasted blood and proven I can resist the complete descent into hunger. Until I've fed and still held my consciousness intact." "You'll lose yourself," he said. "I've seen it happen. The first feeding is the moment when the curse takes the strongest hold. Every predator becomes addicted to the kill on first taste. Then you'll be here," Evangeline said. "To catch me if I fall. To remind me who I am when the hunger tries to tell me I'm only what I eat." She approached the threshold, and the Inquisitors recoiled at the power radiating from her. Not the power of age or experience, but the raw intensity of transformation, fresh and newly complete. She could feel their fear, and the fear was delicious, but she pushed it aside. The young woman with the blood memory looked at Evangeline with recognition. "I was made to help you," the woman said, and her voice held no fear. "That's my purpose. To be the test case. To prove whether a newly turned vampire can resist the hunger or whether the curse will always win in the end." Evangeline extended her hand. "What's your name?" "Victoria," the young woman said. "And I'm not here as prey. I'm here as witness. I'm here to help you." Cassius appeared at Evangeline's side, his presence a barrier but not a refusal. He understood what was happening. This was the final test, not of hunger but of choice. Of whether Evangeline could take what the curse demanded and still remain herself. Victoria extended her wrist. The moment was crystalline, eternal. Evangeline could feel the hunger in her. 800 years of her prince's accumulated desire, centuries of suppression, the raw animal need to consume and consume until the world was empty. Her fangs extended. Her mouth found the offered wrist, and she drank. The experience of feeding was nothing like the careful blood sharing with Cassius. It was raw and primal and absolutely overwhelming. Victoria's blood carried the memory of every vampire it had ever touched, and for a moment, Evangeline found herself drowning in a cascade of consciousness. 700 different hunger moments, 700 different prey, death, 700 different perspectives on predation. She felt herself losing grip on her identity. She felt the hunger expanding, wanting more, wanting to drain Victoria completely, wanting to spill out into the night and hunt everything that breathed. And then she felt Cassius's hand on her shoulder, his consciousness reaching into hers, a reminder of who she was beneath the hunger. "Stay with me," he said, and it was a prayer and an anchor and a covenant renewed. "Stay with me, Evangeline. I am here. I will always be here." She pulled back from Victoria's wrist before the hunger could claim her completely. Victoria was laughing, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," the young woman said. "You actually did it. You resisted. I've never felt that in a newly turned vampire. Every one of them has always wanted just a moment more, just a little bit deeper. But you stopped. You actually stopped." Evangeline's fangs retracted, and she found herself crying too. Tears that fell like blood, like recognition, like the moment a curse begins to fracture. The Inquisitors at the threshold retreated, and Evangeline understood why. They had come to either recruit her or destroy her, but she had done something else entirely. She had proven that the curse could be resisted, that free will could exist even in damnation. That love could matter more than hunger. Cassius pulled her back into the manor, and the doors slammed shut behind them. Outside, the hunters regrouped in the darkness, understanding that they had underestimated what a soul-bonded vampire might become. But inside the manor, in the candlelit chamber where 7 lifetimes of blood oaths had been witnessed, Evangeline found herself held against her prince's chest, listening to the steady heartbeat of someone who had been dead for 800 years but had never truly lived until now. The trial was complete. The choice was made. The night of the new moon. The darkness opposite to the blood moon that had begun all of this, Cassius took her to the covenant chamber. It was different now. Where before it had been a place of judgment and trial, it had transformed into something gentler. The black stone walls had lightened to silver, and the spiral at the center pulsed with a light that was neither divine nor profane but something in between. "This is where your grandmother made her covenant," Cassius said, leading her toward the spiral, 46 years ago. She was 37 years old, and she understood that accepting the bond meant accepting isolation from every mortal she had ever known. But she came here anyway, and she spoke her oath before the witness, and she changed everything. Evangeline could see the impressions her grandmother had left, echoes of determination and love and absolute certainty. She could see the moment her grandmother had chosen her prince, and understood that it had been both sacrifice and liberation. "She was the strongest of all of you," Cassius said quietly. "Mathilde loved me because she couldn't help it. Agnes and Catherine loved me through desperation and familiarity. But your grandmother loved me because she chose to. Every moment of every day she chose to continue loving me despite the cost. And I choose you," Evangeline said, "not because of prophecy or curse or the weight of 7 lifetimes. But because when I look at you, I see the man you were before the curse, trapped in the monster that curse created, and I see the man you're becoming now that the curse is breaking, and I choose all of it." She stepped into the spiral, and the light beneath her feet intensified. "The witness," she called. "I stand here to acknowledge my covenant." The darkness gathered, condensed, reformed into the figure that had witnessed her trial. But where before it had been faceless, now it held something that might have been approval. "The vampire and the woman who was born to save her," it said. "The curse and the covenant, the hunger and the heart. Speak your binding words." Cassius stepped into the spiral beside her, taking her hand. "I am 817 years old," he said, and every century lived was in his voice. "I have been damned and isolated and utterly, completely alone. I have fed and hunted and destroyed because I could not help what I had become. But in her, I found redemption not through redemption, but through the simple fact of being seen, being known, being loved despite everything I am. I bind myself to her not through hunger, not through curse, but through the choice to be better because she believes I can be." He knelt, and in kneeling made himself equal to the woman who had started as mortal and transformed into his eternal equal. "I am Evangeline," she said, and her voice was steady and sure. "I am the heir of 7 lifetimes of women who loved a man the world had damned. I am the product of their sacrifice and their courage and their absolute certainty that love could matter more than curse. I bind myself not to save him, but to stand beside him. To face the darkness together, knowing that even in immortality, even in the hunger and the violence, there can be grace. There can be choice. There can be love." She pulled Cassius to his feet and kissed him. It was not the frantic, desperate kiss of their first meeting. It was deeper, slower, more complex. In it lived all 7 lifetimes of memory. It held the recognition of Mathilde meeting him in candlelight. It held the courage of Agnes fleeing the hunters. It held the terrible struggle of Catherine fighting madness. It held the steady determination of her grandmother's 46 years. And it held Evangeline's own choice, not inherited or compelled, but freely made. When they broke apart, the covenant chamber had transformed entirely. The walls had become translucent, and beyond them Evangeline could see the manor as it truly was, not a Victorian mansion, but an echo of Valdres. The kingdom that had burned in 1451 was here, preserved in magical crystal, waiting for a prince to return with his queen. "The covenant is acknowledged," the witness said, and its voice held something like joy. "The curse begins to break. Not the hunger that will remain your eternal struggle, not the darkness that will always be your home, but the isolation ends. The damnation is lightened. The prince and his queen are bound, and nothing in this world or the next will ever sever that bond." The witness dispersed into light, and the chamber began to dissolve around them. But instead of panic, Evangeline felt only peace. They emerged into the manor's eastern library, the room where her grandmother's journal had been waiting. The books on the shelves had changed. They were older now, written in languages that hadn't existed for centuries, filling with knowledge that could only exist in a vampire's eternal memory. "Your library," Evangeline said. "Our library," Cassius corrected. "Everything I have, everything I am, is yours now. The manor, the gardens that remember Valdres, the centuries of learning, the taste of every lifetime I've lived. It's all ours together." Outside, dawn was approaching. The first real dawn since her transformation. Evangeline braced herself for the pain that the hunter's stories had promised, the way sunlight burned vampire flesh, the way the sun was both weapon and barrier. But as the first light touched the manor's windows, she felt only gentleness. "The curse is lighter," Cassius said with wonder. "I can barely feel it. The barrier between day and night is thinning. Perhaps in time, with the covenant acknowledged and the curse breaking further, we might walk in both worlds. Perhaps neither of us will be entirely locked into darkness. And perhaps," Evangeline said, watching the sunrise paint the gardens crimson and gold, "that's what redemption actually is. Not a return to what we were, but the freedom to become what we choose." In the gardens of Blackthorn Manor, In the place where 7 lifetimes of women had learned to love a damned prince, the roses seemed to bloom in colors that had no names in the mortal world. They had 3 weeks of peace. 3 weeks of learning each other not as myth or memory, but as presence. 3 weeks of Cassius showing Evangeline the manor's true scope. The underground libraries that went deeper than any foundation should allow, the mirrors that showed other worlds, the gardens that bloomed with flowers that existed nowhere else in creation. 3 weeks of Evangeline discovering that love didn't require simplicity, that she could hold infinite complexity in her heart and still find coherence. But on the 22nd day, something changed in the very substrate of reality. "They're coming," Cassius said, and his voice held a resignation that hadn't been present in 3 weeks. Evangeline felt it too, a wrongness at the edge of her awareness, a gathering darkness that was distinct from the natural darkness of their predatory night. Multiple presences converging on Blackthorn Manor, but these weren't the hunters. These were older things, older hungers, the vampire covens. Evangeline said, understanding flowing through her from the memories that lived in Cassius's blood. "The families that tried to make you teach them the soul bond. They're calling in debts," Cassius said quietly. "For 800 years, they've allowed me to exist, to live in isolation, to be odd and melancholic and useless. And in exchange, they've waited for the moment when I would finally break, would finally complete a binding, would finally give them access to the knowledge they need to create soul bonds of their own. That's not going to happen," Evangeline said. "No," he agreed. "But they don't know that yet. They're coming to collect what they believe they're owed." Evangeline moved to the manor's highest tower and extended her senses across the surrounding lands. She could count them, 20 vampires of varying ages, coming from different directions, coordinated by something more ancient than any of them individually. "There's a leader," Evangeline said. "Someone older than you, I think, someone that feels like a first vampire, like something that was made by the original curse before it fractured into 1,000 different hungers." "That would be Elizaveta," Cassius said from behind her. "She's the mother of our bloodline, the first vampire, made when the original curse broke across humanity like a plague. She's been consolidating power for 3,000 years, waiting for someone strong enough to access soul, binding so she could weaponize it, so she could create armies of bound vampires who would obey her absolutely. And you're what she's been waiting for," Evangeline said. "I am. The prophet said I would either break the curse or be consumed by it. Elizaveta is betting on the latter." The sun descended, and Evangeline felt the change in Cassius, the way his power multiplied as darkness fell, the way he became less restrained, less careful, more purely what centuries had made him. She had experienced his full predatory nature in small doses, but now as the night deepened and the threat approached, she felt the magnitude of what he truly was. He was not a prince anymore. He was a weapon, a tool that had been forged in suffering and honed by 800 years of hunger. And he was terrified of what she would think if she saw him fully unleashed. "Cassius," she said and pulled him close. "I know what you are. I've tasted in your blood. I've lived it in my own memories. I'm not asking you to be careful. I'm asking you to survive. And I'm going to survive beside you." The manor's doors burst open. Elizaveta was nothing like the hunters. Where they had worn holiness like armor, she wore age like a crown. She was impossibly tall, impossibly beautiful, and her presence filled the manor like floodwater, filling every space, drowning out everything else. "Hello, cousin," she said to Cassius, and her voice held 8,000 years of hunger barely contained. "I've been waiting so long for this moment. For you to finally bind with a soul, mate vampire, and give us the knowledge we need." "No," Cassius said simply. Elizaveta laughed, and the sound was a weapon. It shattered the manor's chandeliers and cracked the ancient stone walls. "You've always been so stubborn," she said. "Let me explain how this works. I have 20 of my finest hunters outside. You can either come with me peacefully, share your knowledge, and watch as I preserve your beloved in crystalline stasis while I create an army of soul-bonded vampires, or I can take her now, break the binding, and absorb her essence into my own consciousness. Either way, I win. The only question is whether you spend the next 1,000 years watching her suffer or watching her rest in comfortable oblivion." Evangeline stepped forward. "Elizaveta," she said, and the name felt right in her mouth, felt like the word that had been waiting to be spoken since before her transformation. "I know you, not from Cassius's memories but from before, from the bloodline memories that go back to the original curse. You were the first one to accept damnation without struggle. You made yourself the hunger incarnate. And you," Elizaveta said, turning that terrible attention toward her, "are an interesting aberration, a mortal who somehow birthed herself into eternal life without losing her consciousness. Rare, beautiful, exactly the tool I need." "No," Evangeline said, and there was something in her voice that made Elizaveta pause. "I'm something else entirely. I'm not a tool. I'm not even a bargain struck in darkness. I'm the person who finally broke the original curse, and I'm calling in the depth." She reached out with her newborn vampire senses, and did something that only someone who had been both mortal and immortal could do. She reached into the binding that connected every vampire to the original curse, and she pulled, not on their hunger, not on their darkness, on the memory of the priest's prayer. Elizaveta screamed. It was a sound that hadn't been uttered in 3,000 years, not the scream of predator or hunger, but the scream of something touching the pain from which it had never truly escaped. The original curse, the one that had created her, the one that had been written in blood and prayer and dying hope. It was suddenly present, suddenly immediate, suddenly impossible to ignore. The other vampires outside felt it too. The binding that connected them to their dark god, the thirst that had always driven them forward, suddenly became visible, became undeniable, became a choice rather than a compulsion. And for the first time in their eternal lives, they could choose to stop. Some of them fled, unable to face the magnitude of that choice. But others, 5 of them, standing at the manor's threshold, they chose to stay. They chose not to fight. They chose to acknowledge that there might be another way to exist in darkness without being consumed by it. Elizaveta began to dissolve, her form fragmenting like a million-year-old painting finally crumbling. But instead of disappearing entirely, she reformed smaller, weaker, but still present. And in her reformation, Evangeline saw something like gratitude. "You freed me," the first vampire said, and her voice held the recognition of someone touching their own forgotten mortality for the first time in millennia. "You made the hunger a choice. I made the damnation a choice," Evangeline corrected gently. "You can still hunger, still feed, still be what you are. But you don't have to be slaves to it anymore. You don't have to be what the original curse demanded." The first vampire dissipated into starlight and memory, and Evangeline felt her consciousness integrating the 3,000-year history of a curse being slowly, carefully rewritten by love. When Cassius caught her, she was barely conscious. "You did it," he said, holding her close as the manor settled around them, as the threat dissolved, as the night suddenly became just a night again, dark and peaceful in theirs. "You actually did it. You broke the original curse." "We broke it," Evangeline whispered, falling asleep in his arms. Together, 3 months after Elizaveta dissolved into starlight, Evangeline walked through the gardens of Valdris with a clarity that no mortal had ever experienced. The curse was broken, not in the way the prophecy had suggested. She hadn't redeemed Cassius through her love or transformed him back into a human. The curse couldn't be reversed, couldn't be unmade. But it had been fundamentally restructured. The hunger remained, yes. The darkness remained, yes. But now they were choices rather than compulsions, possibilities rather than inevitabilities. "Do you regret it?" Cassius asked, moving beside her through roses that bloomed in colors that had no names. "Never," Evangeline said. "Ask me again in 100 years when we're still young and the world has changed beyond recognition. Ask me in 1,000 years. When you've taught me 800 years worth of knowledge that I'll need just to survive what eternity becomes. Ask me when the sun finally burns itself out and we have to find a new way to be alive in the darkness. But right now, in this moment, with your hand in mine and the possibility of infinite tomorrows, no. I never regret this." She turned to face him fully, and in the moonlight she was exactly what she was born to become, not a mortal woman, not a monster, but something in between, a bridge between worlds, a queen who could walk in darkness and not be consumed by it. "The 5 vampires who chose to stay," she said, "they've been asking to help, to rebuild Valdris, not as a kingdom in the mortal world, but as a sanctuary, a place where vampires who want to resist the hunger can come for guidance." Cassius considered this, and she felt his hesitation. After 800 years of isolation, the idea of building community, of trying to create something positive in a life that had been defined by consumption and darkness, seemed impossibly fragile. "It would work," Evangeline said, "because you would be there, because I would be there, and because sometimes, the most powerful magic in the world is simply showing someone else that a different choice exists." She pulled him close, and kissed him under the blood moon that was just beginning to wax again, not full and terrible as it had been at their awakening, but gentler now, almost sympathetic to the change that had occurred in the night it had witnessed. "I have a proposition," Cassius said, and there was something almost human in his hesitation, something almost shy. "Something I've been meaning to ask you for 3 months but kept finding reasons to delay." He reached into the depths of his coat and withdrew something that glowed softly in his palm, a ring, not made of gold or silver, but of something that looked like crystallized moonlight. Set into it was a stone the color of fresh blood but not quite red, the color that exists only in dreams. "I was a prince once," he said quietly, "and I have long since lost the right to offer you crowns and kingdoms. But I have this, made from the last magic of Valdris, strengthened by the covenant we forged, sealed with the curse that we broke together. It's not a promise of happiness. Immortal love is too complex a thing for such simple promises. But it is a promise of presence, of witness, of standing together in the darkness and finding it beautiful because you're here beside me." Evangeline felt tears slide down her cheeks as she extended her hand. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. The darkness, the hunger, the 1,000 years of learning, the uncertainty, the terrible beautiful possibility of forever. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it seemed to merge with her skin, becoming part of her, burning so gently it felt like warmth instead of pain. And in that moment, As the blood moon hung overhead and the gardens of Valdris bloomed around them with flowers that had been waiting 800 years to see a prince smile again, Evangeline understood the truth that 7 lifetimes of women had been trying to teach her. Redemption wasn't about being saved. It was about choosing to love something broken and believing, not hoping, but truly believing, that love itself could be enough to make the brokenness bearable, even beautiful. She was eternal now. She would walk through centuries, watching empires rise and fall, watching the world transform into things she couldn't currently imagine. She would hunger, and she would resist that hunger, and sometimes she would fail. She would have to accept her own monstrosity alongside her own capacity for grace, but she would never be alone in it. And that, she realized as Cassius pulled her close and spun her through the impossible garden in an embrace that was equal parts predator and prince, was the only redemption either of them had ever needed. Outside the manor, in the mortal world, hunters continued their eternal pursuit. Covens continued their ancient games. Darkness continued, as it always had, as it always would, but inside the gardens of Valdris, in the space between worlds where a curse was breaking and a covenant was holding, there was something the darkness had never known before. There was love that chose itself every moment. There was hunger tempered by grace. There was eternity made bearable by the simple fact of being seen. And as the blood moon descended and the sun rose impossibly alongside it, a glimpse of the day when the barriers between worlds would dissolve completely, Evangeline knew that this was not an ending. This was only the beginning of forever.